To come back to Pamuk, so you described how when Pamuk came of age as a writer, he avoided the Arabian Nights, but that didn't stay that way.
Pamuk, when he wrote the Black Book, which is one of his early masterpieces, he wrote a certain kind of frame tale himself. Every second chapter in that novel is a story within a story. It's in fact a newspaper column written by Jalal, a character who may have run off with the protagonist's beautiful wife, Ruya. For that novel, Pamuk actually found himself going back to the sort of earlier frame narrative as an inspiration. And in particular, this idea of there's almost a competition of storytelling which is reminiscent of Boccaccio. There's a chapter in Pamuk's novel, in the Black Book, called Love Tales on a Snowy Night. And it's a chapter where these journalists are stuck in a cafe late at night and they decide to start competing and telling fascinating, the most interesting stories, the most astonishing stories. And this is his nod to the tradition of the Arabian Nights. And he even decided to expand that when he was asked to do a screenplay based on the Black Book. And his screenplay was based entirely on this Arabian Nights chapter. Of course, there are other references in the Black Book as well. Students may find references to Aladdin's store, for example. Perhaps quite fittingly, because the Black Book is, I think, it's best to think of it not as a novel, but as a kind of a prose collection. In a sense, it's not unlike The Thousand and One Nights. It's a series of small jewels and marvelous little anecdotes strung together.
So would you agree with the statement that originally Pamuk tried to run away from The Thousand and One Nights, but they ultimately caught up with him?
Yes. There's something about story collections. They tend to gobble up other stories, and writers, however, reluctantly as well.
And you earlier mentioned Rushdie as another figure who has an interesting and complicated relation to the Knights.
Yes, as a young writer, Salman Rushdie was very politically engaged. And he found that the narrative of Shahrazad defying tyranny night by night through storytelling, triumphing by answering power with stories. This was something he wanted to do himself.
So the figure of the political writer.
Exactly. And if you go back and read the first page of his first novels, there's a reference to the Arabian Nights in each one of them. Midnight sort of begins with Salim Sinai saying, "I must write fast, faster than Shahrazad." And there's this very explicit way in which he was trying to counter a certain pessimism about what was going on in India with the emergency rule and Indira Gandhi and the suspension of constitutional freedoms. He would say in interviews, for example, that the pessimism of the political reality, he sought to answer that with the promise of literature, the promise of these embedded stories, the promise of Arabian Nights style of writing that has a certain kind of hope in the power of stories themselves to overcome political tyranny.
So early on, or in his most important novels, he's inspired by the Arabian Nights. More recently, he has presented a more explicit engagement in a story called Harun in the Sea of Stories. Does that confirm your view that A Thousand and One Nights is incredibly important for Rushdie?
Very much so. I mean, I think writers like Salman Rushdie, or like Goethe for that matter, who kept coming back to The Thousand and One Nights over the course of a very long writing career, they manifest different relationships to the corpus of tales. And Rushdie, after the fatwa against him for writing The Satanic Verses, a novel that also draws on The Thousand and One Nights. There's a very explicit retelling of Aladdin that I've written about. He found himself in a very allegorical way, differently from his previous engagement with the story, presenting almost a kind of binary where in Harun in the Sea of Stories, The Thousand and One Nights represents a kind of secular, skeptical, tolerant tradition, which Rushdie chooses to oppose to a more theocratic and theological tradition. I'm not sure this is true of the way Rushdie thought before or after that particular text, but it was this one moment of despair where perhaps he simplified the equation, he polarized the place of The Thousand and One Nights and the Arabic and Islamic storytelling traditions.
So there's a good Islamic tradition represented by The Thousand and One Nights and a bad one that's represented by the Quran or something like that.
According to Salman Rushdie, in that novel, in this allegory which perhaps collapses the weight of its own ponderous oppositions. But generally Rushdie is more complex and nuanced and interesting in the way that he engages The Thousand and One Nights as representative of different, overlapping traditions, be they within Arabic storytelling and literature, or be they as Islamic practices as well, that are represented in these tales, right? The tales often involve genies. They involve all sorts of superstitions pertaining to the jinn, which contradict what is said about in the Quran. So that the relationship, as Rushdie knows from his previous work is a much more complex one, than this allegorical opposition that he insists upon in Harun and the Sea of Stories.
So it seems that you think that Harun and the Sea of Stories is actually not the most interesting of
Not at all.
Rushdie's engagements with
Not
the
at all.
1001
Not at
Nights.
all. I mean, a novel like Midnight's Children, The 1001 Nights, serves his narrative of needing to answer power. An even more dystopic novel about Pakistan. It's a novel where Rushdie didn't see a way to express optimism.
Yeah.
There's a kind of Arabian nightmare. So there's a kind of parallel Arabian Nights. All the references to the Arabian Nights are inverted.
Yeah.
There's a Sinbad, there's a Harun. They're all kind of the opposite of what they should be. He's always engaging with the Arabian Nights in a very interesting way. And in the Satanic Verses, he draws upon the Arabian Nights as well. The protagonist of the Satanic Verses, his name is Salahuddin, but it becomes reduced to Saladin. And he's obsessed with the magic lamp that his father has promised him. From his childhood, he sees this lamp in his father's study next to a copy of Burton's Arabian Nights, as Rushdie writes. And there's this whole narrative of wanting the lamp, the father withholding the lamp from him. And it seems like in that novel, the Arabian Nights represents a kind of a cosmopolitan Arabic tradition and Muslim tradition that he has been denied by his father, by not getting the lamp, which is metonymic for the Arabian Nights, which the lamp is just next to on his father's bookshelf. That is a more complex, sort of a richer understanding that Rushdie exhibits in his fiction.